So as people trickle in, we are just waiting for another minute before we start. Okay, welcome. I'm Luzia Leifert, head of the Impact and Innovation Lab at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and I am your host today. This is the fourth event in our web series on digital think tanking in times of COVID-19, for which we have teamed up with WonkComms and Soapbox. Why are we doing this? With the corona crisis disrupting normal operations, forcing staff to work remotely, putting an end to face-to-face events, and sending legislators and governments home, think tanks are having to rethink business on the fly. And for an industry that is built around cross-sector and transnational cooperation, this crisis verges on an existential threat to an entire model. We need new approaches and we need them fast. It's a moment of change, yes, but we are convinced that there is a silver lining in this otherwise dire crisis, because now is a moment for innovation, for new tools and skills that will extend beyond the immediate crisis and leave our organizations stronger than ever. And we are in this together. So each week, experts from across our community will share tips and tools for bringing your work as a think tank online. Today's topic is, as you all know, cybersecurity and data protection, how to enable safe spaces or safer spaces, for what it's worth, for sensitive conversations online. Before we delve more into this, just a few notes on how you can participate and what this is all about. So so this is just a way to make your participation nicer. You can change to gallery view, which will allow you to see both of us at the same time. Of course, there are several ways to participate in the conversation. So you can ask all your questions in the chat. We will take them up at the end. Please let us start by introducing ourselves in the chat. So just feel free to write your names, organizations, and countries in the chat to see who else is around. And we will have two surveys, first one now and the other one at the end of today. And of course, feel free to live tweet about today's conversation using the hashtags WonkComms and Digital Think Tanking. Now, about our topic today. We are a community of think tankers around the world, and this series is entirely based on what interests you and what is useful for you. So the topics we cover have been brought up in numerous conversations with fellow think tankers, as was this one as well. Because the corona crisis has led to what many felt was a shock digitization of the world. Next to schools and companies, also political institutions, and also think tanks have had to move their entire operations online. So we've seen UN Security Council meetings online with all the difficulties that all of us know, connected to video conferences, European Council meetings as video conferences, cabinet meetings, this one from the UK, and also think tanks, of course. So this is an example from my organization, the German Council on Foreign Relations, from our press statement from mid-March, saying that we will all be working from home on a mobile basis, which is still true for most of us. This is an example from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, sending out their newsletters, telling us that all of their events have moved online. Brookings, it's the same. And a tweet by Stockholm Environment Institute saying the same. And this is also a very common view on Twitter nowadays, a coverage of like a screen of several experts talking in a video conference. So some of us were better prepared than others, of course, but for most of us, I'd say we have been treading new terrain in the past couple of weeks, having to get up to speed as fast as we could. And now many of us in the thinking world are in the business of off-the-record background meetings and confidential policy advice, and in foreign policy, even in B or C level diplomacy. So this is what we offer to policymakers, to our clients, to stakeholders, basically safe spaces to think through an idea before it goes out into the open. Many of us also work on particularly sensitive topics such as defense policy, peace negotiations, cybersecurity, or just doing research on authoritarian regimes where maybe our speakers and participants might fear retribution from their own governments for speaking out. In face-to-face events, we therefore have rules to ensure confidentiality, or at least help ensure confidentiality. For example, the famous Chatham House rule, or in German, we also know this format unter drei. But is there a way to ensure at least some level of confidentiality at a time when, due to the Corona lockdowns, many think tanks had to move their operations online? In our first event in this web series, we asked our participants which video conferencing tools their think tank uses for online events. And this is what we found. An overwhelming majority uses Zoom. And also there's a big spread across different apps and software, which sometimes leads to less compatibility between different organizations if you want to join forces. And also this is a fragmentation basically. And also we found that several think tanks are using various tools at the same time for different purposes. Hence, when we read in the news about Zoom bombing, attention tracking, false claims of end-to-end encryption, we are, of course, alarmed. And this is all right. So this one, for example, it's this picture that we had before from this cabinet meeting from the UK, where Johnson famously shared this picture on Twitter, and then it was possible to see the Zoom ID up there. And there were other examples, numerous of them. You've probably all followed the news. So this is government meetings, but also, of course, if we want to be better and prepare and provide safer spaces than government, or have these stakeholders in our conversations, then we have to be careful as well. And this is just a Twitter tweet from yesterday. So what we have here today is actually a very great speaker. We have Matthias with us, Matthias Schulze from SWP in Berlin, a foreign policy think tank. And with him, we want today look at how think tanks can deal with this challenge of cybersecurity and data protection. And the goal is to provide both a bit of background information on how all this works technically in a way, and also some practical advice for how to create safe spaces or safer spaces for sensitive conversations. And it will also be great to hear about your own experiences and exchange good practices in a spirit of peer learning. So first of all, I see, did anyone else share their names and organizations? Okay, great. So first of all, to see what your own experience have been, we created a Zoom survey. And before, while I'm introducing our speaker for today, please fill in this survey so to let us know what your experience has been so far. So you should all be able to see the survey now. And you can vote. And if you don't see it, then just let us know in the chat. Okay, so Matthias researches cybersecurity and cyber conflict dynamics, disinformation, and related policy issues such as encryption, lawful access, vulnerability disclosure at the SWP in Berlin. He holds a PhD in international relations, so he's basically a political scientist, and from Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, where he previously worked as a research assistant and lecturer. And some of his latest publications have been German military cyber operations are in a legal gray zone with Lawfare blog, and also Digital Spheres of Influence, a research paper with his own institution. So why we wanted to have Matthias with us on this event today is because, of course, he researches cybersecurity, but he's also working in a think tank himself that had to think through and go through all these issues as well as all of us. Unfortunately, as you probably have seen already, we weren't lucky to get hold of Eva Galperin, so she won't join us today. So there's just more time for your questions and your experiences. And I'll hand over to Matthias now to share his knowledge and experience with us.
Hi, thank you, Claire. Thanks for the invite. My name is Matthias, as Claire kindly introduced me. I work on cybersecurity stuff over at SWP. I also run a podcast on these things, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the safety of Zoom and online discussions in the realm of digital think tanking, so to speak. So Claire gave me a question in advance to prepare the talk, and she asked me how safe are Zoom, Teams, BlueJeans, and all these other tools that you probably heard about by now. And when you work in cybersecurity, the problem is that you really cannot generally answer this type of question, because how safe something is depends basically on who you are and what your threat model is. Perfectly, thank you. And threat models generally include aspects such as what are your risks? And the risk is basically losing something of value. The next question is what are threats? And threats basically are what causes you to lose something, and are really particular to your situation and who you basically are. And the last aspect is what IT systems are you generally using and how is your infrastructure looking like? So what does this mean for think tank, this general descriptions? Let's talk about maybe some general threats for think tanks in terms of cybersecurity. Probably the biggest one is confidentiality. So confidential information gets stolen. For example, sensitive information exchange with policymakers, say about a new fighter jet that Germany wants to buy, being able to carry nuclear weapons and stuff like that. So this could be sensitive information that could leak through video conference calls. Alternatively, your reputation might get harmed by this. For example, if the content of the video is leaked to the press. And there was a lovely incident in 2014 in Ukraine where US Ambassador Nuland had her phone tapped, and then probably Russian agents leaked her conversations where she famously said, "Fuck the Europeans," about their participation in the Ukraine crisis in 2014. And this was really inconvenient for her. Or online content in video conference talks could be used against you in terms of blackmail, for example. More generally speaking, not particularly tied to Zoom calls per se, is the risk that your financial assets might be at risk. This depends on what your financial structure is, if you rely on external donors, for example. But there are also, general cybersecurity issues like CEO fraud, or if the budget department suddenly works from home and their computers are getting hacked and the paycheck information gets stolen from their laptops, for example. General threat. Then you have denial of service, which basically is or means that someone shuts down your operation, which is really inconvenience in times of home office where you rely on your IT system to work. And this could be, a retaliation measure, for example, for a critical paper that you published. And lastly, the most relevant point, I think, is that you could be used as a think tank as a jump-off point for cyber attacks against politicians or other higher value targets. What that means is attackers are not generally interested in you, but think that you have connections to people in higher echelons of power and might use you as a jump-off point to get in contact with them and penetrate their systems via your email system, for example. All of this depends on who you are, what your IT system is, and what your areas of research are. So let's talk about some threats. The most relevant one that we probably forget all the time are insiders. This is your disgruntled employee with access to your payment systems or contact libraries or internal communication, leaking this stuff to the press, selling it to a foreign agent, or whatever could be done with that. Then you have your script kiddies. You know, this is your teenager hacker in the basement, so to speak, doing bad things to your networks. You have your cybercrime issues, which is basically ransomware shutting down your system and demanding a ransom pay. You know, hospitals are struck by this all the time, and it can happen with think tanks as well. The good news is that you can realistically defend against those three threats with basically business-grade IT security tools. This is something like rights management. This is segregation of sensitive networks. This is internal logging, intrusion detection, password policies, and two-factor authentication, to name a few. It's not necessarily easy to do this for smaller think tanks, but it's doable. And now the bad news, then there are state-sponsored attacks, basically with the purpose of intelligence gathering. And this is a little bit more tricky, because unfortunately, during the last years, think tanks and political foundations in general have moved into the focus of foreign intelligence agencies. And the problem is that these cyber espionage skills proliferate quite easily. So even smaller actors are now able to penetrate systems that they were not able to do so a few years ago. So we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about North Korea, we're talking about Turkey. And let's not forget the United States, Israel, Great Britain, as the Snowden leaks from, what is it now, 7 years ago, mentioned so nicely. Espionage does not stop at allies, right? Especially in times of higher transatlantic tensions. And an intelligence officer once said to me, and I found this quite funny, he said, spying among friends is a no-go. But in the intelligence world, there are no friends, there are only partners. And then he winked at me and found it very funny. So if you are working on certain regions, or if you have like offices in certain regions of interest, you might automatically become a target for foreign intelligence agencies. And this has to do with your external perception. Even though you think you don't have anything interesting in your network, because whatever you do gets published anyway, for example, or you think you don't even have that deep connections to power centers. From the outside, this is not obvious. Yeah, just assume for a second the perspective of an intelligence agency of an authoritarian regime. In authoritarian regimes, the idea of independent think tanks is basically absurd, as think tanks in authoritarian regimes are often front organizations for governments. For example, to spread ideas or propaganda, or serve as a recruitment tool for political elites. And because of this perception, think tanks are a target for espionage. And now let's talk about Zoom a little bit, because this is what I was asked to talk about in the first place. You probably all read the news, and I just copy-pasted some of the news here. The thing is that the Zoom trend that we are seeing right now, as we are in Zoom right now, was not unnoticed by intelligence agencies. There are some rumors out there. Of course, everything is pretty hard to attribute in this domain. There are some rumors that Chinese intelligence agencies target Zoom for economic espionage. They basically want to know what companies in the West are doing in their home offices. And if the Chinese are doing it, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans are likely to follow. The funny thing is that the easy usability of Zoom basically means that many people use it, and this includes policymakers, as you have seen with the previous slides by Claire. And this makes it worthwhile to invest capacities to penetrate this system. Because even state-sponsors attackers go for the targets with the best bang for the buck ratio, which basically means email, WhatsApp, and maybe now Zoom. Why? Because communication channels are generally the attack window to hijack devices, because they can connect to the internet and open a window to attack, so to speak. Yes, and then there are some issues with Zoom, like, for example, the lack of meaningful encryption. I have your encryption 101 here on this slide. Zoom said that they use end-to-end encryption, which was not true. So they made a false statement about their encryption policy on their website. Instead, they used TLS encryption. The difference between TLS encryption or transport layer security and end-to-end encryption basically is that with TLS, the message gets decrypted on Zoom's servers and then gets encrypted again for delivery, which basically means it can be intercepted at the server as well. So the gold standard is end-to-end encryption, and you want that in your video conference tool. Zoom also had other issues like rather sloppy programming, which could imply that the Zoom servers that handle this talk and these communications are not really secure as well. We don't know this yet, but it's safe to assume, or we can assume something like that. And of course, your notebooks and your end devices could be infected with malware and provide an entry point to intercept communications. Because the issue is, as we are working in home office nowadays, chances are that you're using your personal device for communications, for example. And your personal devices generally tend to be less secure than, for example, corporate devices, or I don't know, if you have like military grade hardware, which most of you don't have, but it's safe to say that personal devices tend to be not as secure. The upside is that Zoom promised to work on this, and I think there's some credible information out there that they're turning their ship around in terms of security. So this brings me to my second big talking point is, so what can we do about this? What can think tanks do to protect against these types of threats? And this brings me to my lessons learned basically from the last months or so. For SWP, the issue is that we value trust and confidentiality quite much. These are core values to our organizations, which basically means that most of our events are not public, but invite only, because the goal is to create safe spaces for policymakers to share and discuss ideas that they don't necessarily want to see printed in the media the next day. And if you take this as a premise, the conclusion is that you cannot really trust any voice over IP or video conference call system that is beyond your control. So what does it mean? Like most of us, in early March, we started with an internal screening process about the available tools on the market. And we looked for key factors such as, where is the data hosted? Remember that most states have lawful access orders in place. So for example, with national security letters, law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies can waltz in and extract your data in the name of national security from a company. And if you rely on a third party like Microsoft or Zoom, then this is an issue. And just keep in mind, this is not just China. This is not just Huawei. This is also in the US and in other European states. The second factor was, does it have end-to-end encryption, which is, as I said, the gold standard. The third factor was, is it open source and can we customize it to our needs? And the fourth factor was, under which jurisdiction is the service? And in this case, the European services generally fare better in terms of privacy than US services. Unfortunately, this produced a rather short list of services. And what we found is that there is a general trade-off between well-tested, scalable, and easy-to-use US tools like Zoom or Skype for Business or WebEx and others. This is not a complete list, by the way. And more open source tools which are not as reliably working, but are of European origin, such as Whereby, for example, Wire, Jitsi, or Big Blue Button. So in the beginning, in March, we experimented with Jitsi, which checks all our boxes basically. It's open source, it can be self-hosted, and it offers encryption. However, Jitsi is a peer-to-peer system, and these are not easy to host. There are some bandwidth limitations that you need to consider. Sometimes you need dedicated server equipment with enough computing capacities to host this. And what we found was that Jitsi did not really work for us reliably. So the quality was rather bad. There were some hiccups there, and it was not really nice. So as a workaround, like many organizations, we moved to Zoom as well, which generally works well, but gives us a lot of headaches in terms of security and privacy. So what we did was we decided that Zoom cannot be used for any sensitive internal process, for example, budget discussions, or basically any instance where relational data concerning persons is processed. So this means no recruitment talks via Zoom either. So we use Zoom only for public events like our roundtable formats, as long as there's nothing sensitive involved, because you cannot realistically guarantee confidentiality and should not promote it either, which implies that you have to design your events accordingly, keeping this in mind. And for us, in the end, we came out with a triple solution, so to speak, because there is no one size fits all. For internal discussions, maybe use a self-hosted secure systems and accept the trade-offs in terms of quality. For external conversations, maybe use Zoom because it's rather scalable, everybody has it, and it works with large groups. And the factor that your target audience is probably using it is a factor you might have to consider because it lowers the barrier of entry for people. And if you want to do sensitive political consulting, please use Signal or something, which is end-to-end encrypted and open source. The general problem is that policymakers don't use Signal too much. So we are in for promoting this stuff. And if you would do this as well, this would help us all basically. So my last point is what are our lessons learned? And these are basically a summary of what I just said. Define your risks, your threats, and know your IT infrastructure. Define the criteria that you need from a video conferencing tool and basically how you want to use it, because you cannot guarantee confidentiality and there is no one size that fits all. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you for listening. And I guess now we have Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Matthias. Yeah, I think that's very sobering, and many of the things, of course, are especially complicated for think tanks like yours and also mine, which are in sensitive discussions, but in general, it's a problem for many of us. And I would just would like to encourage everyone to ask your questions to Matthias in the chat, and also share your own experiences, because I think it's very important to see that there are different observations and different security cultures also in different countries and different organizations. So please share your observations from your own country and your think tank with us. Have you observed similar dynamics or rather something else entirely? To get us started on this, I will also publish the results of our Zoom survey from the beginning. This is, you should be able to see the results right now. So actually 14%, I think we are around 35 participants right now, and 22 were there in the beginning to respond to this survey. We have 3 of you who said, okay, you already personally or someone in your organization organized an event and you had an uninvited guest bombing the meeting. No one of you has yet experienced that other people, participants, recorded the event and used or shared it without your permission. That's good. One person said that they have some experience with loss of control over the app due to hacking. So please share in the chat what your experience was, I think, and how you dealt with it. I think that's very important to know and to learn from for all the others. And I think that's actually a very good sign that most of you, like 86%, 19 out of 22, said actually you haven't had this experience yet personally or in your organization, but you are here to learn about how to prevent it in the future. So better safe than sorry. I think that's very encouraging, and it also shows that we are not too late for this event, because I thought it might be more of you who already had this bad experience. The second question was, how comfortable do you feel to hold sensitive conversations online? And this is of course related to the first questions and what your experience have been so far. And 6 of you said that you feel very unsafe and try not to do it online at all. So maybe you might want to share with us what you use instead, if it's not too confidential, to just say like how in general terms you're going about it. What workarounds have you found to using online conferencing tools? Maybe you just use the good old telephone conference or other ways to communicate, like Signal, for example. And then many of you, and this is also encouraging, say, okay, it's not perfect, but okay, as far as your topic area and stakeholders are concerned. So this shows that there are still a lot of think tanks who can, which can operate in their topic areas without being too worried. And maybe also just many of us who are doing public events like this, where it's not so confidential. Thanks a lot for responding to this. And please feel free to, yeah, as I said, share your observations, but also share your questions for Matthias. And I will start asking some. Please, yeah, use the possibility, as long as we have him here, to ask everything that you would like to know. Maybe first, before I can ask a question, I can also just share that at DGAP, we of course had the exact same experience. So in March, we looked for different apps that we might use, and actually already last year we started using Zoom for online events on a much smaller scale, though. Then now, because we are very events-heavy think tanks, but most of them were, of course, face-to-face before, we all had to go entirely online. And then we monitored the situation, because we used Zoom, but of course we also followed the news, and we also did a similar table actually to the one that Matthias presented from SWP, where we thought, okay, what are the criteria? And of course, one of them was also user acceptance. And Matthias already mentioned that, because it's important to see also, for example, if you are working with the defense ministry, or with ministries that just have, or in countries that just have like high data protection culture in public institutions, then of course you have to find platforms that work for most of them, and while at the same time trying not to, you know, have them stop you from doing any work, because you cannot find any common platform that several speakers or several partners will agree to. So we compared these, and we also found that despite Zoom being far from perfect, it's still the best for our purposes. But of course, this is something that might change sooner or later. And also we found that, you know, Zoom is also a lot in the spotlight right now, which doesn't mean that the others are so much better. And we don't know, for example, with some other services such as Cisco WebEx, if it, you know, it was bought from a Chinese company as well. We don't know if it has like a backdoor in its code either. You probably know much more about this. And also Zoom, and we were talking about this when we prepared for this event yesterday, Matthias and I, that, you know, Zoom is under much scrutiny now, and they really have this shitstorm directed at them. But this also helps because it really forces them to get active and improve their standards. And we have also Jitsi as a backup option for very confidential conversations, and now we also have a WebEx option for because yeah, some stakeholders wouldn't want to go on Zoom. And for internal purposes, we generally use Teams, especially for smaller meetings. So what we did for our researchers, we provided everyone in the beginning of April, when it was like a lot in the media about Zoom bombing, we just provided them with a so-called first aid kit for improving security on Zoom, you know, about some things that you can do without changing the app entirely. And of course, yeah, just saying, okay, use, if it's a small meeting, if it's not public, try to use other devices or other services such as Microsoft Teams, and also use a password for your Zoom event. So I hope you all had to type in a password today. We try to do that for all our events now. Also, of course, use the waiting room function for your Zoom event, so that, you know, not anyone can just jump in the meeting midway through because they just found a link online and then they just come in. But so you really you can see the names of the people, and you can decide one by one who you want to let in and who you don't know. And people also had to register. So this is also a thing that many think tanks are making use of right now. You can also deactivate video transmission from participants if you don't have to see everyone, or in webinar mode right now, for example, it's anyway like that. And you can also deactivate screen sharing for participants if you don't need it. So it's not possible to show like any porn images in your serious policy conversation. Yeah, so these are just a couple of things that that we communicated to our researchers as first aid kit. So I'm going to look in the chat now. So there have been a couple of questions. So Henning asks, Zoom is widespread, but many officials we need to reach refuse or are prohibited to use it. By the choice of the web meeting system, we need to inspire a feeling of trust among our customers. Yes, of course. So which one has the best reputation, and how do you assess WebEx? Matthias, would you like to take up this question?
Sure. Thanks, Henning, for the question. Well, so the complicated answer is that no tool or no software in general is 100% safe, as I mentioned. They all tend to have bugs. They all tend to have security vulnerabilities, some more severe than others. So it depends a little bit on the process of the company that is operating this stuff. Generally, you can say that the bigger companies, you know, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Ciscos, in this case of WebEx, they tend to be better with their security practices than, for example, startup culture companies like Zoom. Until a few years ago, Zoom was a larger, rather small startup thing, and then it became a unicorn and went big. And with the problem with these startup culture is that, you know, you have this move fast and break things mentality. So they rush a product to the market and then patch stuff later and fix security vulnerabilities later. And, you know, this whole business model of being fast and being agile comes at the cost of security in many instances, because engineering security is really hard. So as I say, the bigger companies like Microsoft, Google, and so forth, they tend to have better security because their products are in the market much longer, and they have had more time to fix stuff, basically, which does not mean that they are 100% secure, but, you know, generally speaking, they have security processes in place. Just wanted to remind you that Cisco, the company that is operating WebEx, is well known and infamous for zero-day vulnerabilities in their stuff, in their firewalls, in their web servers, and so forth. So they're not perfect as well, but it's generally speaking, it's probably okay to use it for some circumstances. And just a fun fact at the end, the CEO of Zoom, Eric Yuan, he worked at Cisco before, and he was in charge of WebEx, and he left the company because he was so dissatisfied with the product, which I find quite interesting. It doesn't tell you anything about security. It's just an interesting tidbit. So yeah, you probably can use WebEx, but be mindful about that. It's not 100% safe, and think about this.
Yeah, another such anecdote was also that Zoom now, when they promised to rework their security functions, they hired the Facebook manager who was responsible for safety there, and he came and you know, this was also a big boost in trust, at least, or in hope for Zoom to, because he left Facebook because he was dissatisfied there as well about the safety standards. So this is also a question that that's why I asked before, is if this is just more, you know, a shitstorm now at Zoom, and any of the others are not necessarily better, with exception, of course, of the open source ones like Jitsi and others. I also know that that some think tanks, very few of them, but for example, Overseas Development Institute in London, I think they use Blue Jeans. And many schools that have been very concerned with safety of students and teachers, they have used a big blue button. So this is also interesting. Maybe you can say something more about these, which are not in your table here.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the table is not complete. It wouldn't fit on the PowerPoint slide. We screened, I don't know, 20-ish tools, something like that. Not complete list because there's so many, and the video conference market is quite fragmented. So it's, it's really hard to gather them all and do in-depth analysis about their privacy policies and stuff. And sometimes I have other things to do as well, so I can't check out privacy policies all day long. But generally speaking, yeah, Big Blue Button, I have some experience with that. It works sufficiently well, I would say. The others that are out there depend a little bit on your circumstances. For example, we played around with Wire for a while, which is I think it's a German company, or European at least, and they have end-to-end encryption, and they have a messenger app on smartphones, and they work relatively well, but there are some limitations in terms of the quantity of users that you can have in the video call, as far as I know. Maybe they fixed it in the meantime because everyone is now upgrading their video conference software, which is a nice shift maybe to the second questions about what about Google Meet, what about Google Hangouts, what about Apple FaceTime, because all these companies are starting to move. Google was sleeping quite for a time. They didn't really care about their video conferencing tools because they had, they had the Google Messenger, they had Allo, they had Google Meet, and they have Hangouts, and it's like really fragmented. And now they started to upgrade Google Meet. But unfortunately, I don't have any experience with Google Meet. I know Hangouts, and it works pretty well, but the same caveats that I just described for WebEx also apply for Google Hangouts. And what was a downer for us was that in order to use Google Hangouts, you basically need to buy in the Google ecosystem. So you need to have a Google account. And if your work processes use Google Drive and Google Docs and spreadsheets and so forth, then it's perfectly cool to use it, I guess. But for our circumstances, it was not the right thing. Because, if you use Google stuff and you don't have the payment or the paid option, then you're basically selling your data for advertisement purposes. The free stuff, not the pay version. FaceTime, maybe one more last point about Apple FaceTime. Apple FaceTime used to be a little bit different because it's end-to-end encrypted. They have a decentralized approach, though there is no server in between, and it generally works pretty well. There was some limitation that it did not really work very well with larger groups, but I think they fixed it as well. But with FaceTime, you need to buy in the Apple ecosystem, right? Which is maybe a little bit better in terms of security than Google, although it's really hard to say this definitely because there are different issues here. But generally speaking, FaceTime works relatively well. The question is, what do you use in your shop? Do you use Android phones? Do you use iOS devices? And if you have fragmentation, like some people using Android, some people using Apple, then FaceTime is not really a viable option. And it wasn't for us for that reason.
Yeah, thank you. Before we move on to the next question that's in the chat, I would like to stick one more question to this Zoom topic and video conferencing. And I think one thing that I found out, and that actually a colleague of us was dealing with, was that in the name of security and national security goals, some governments have also imposed online restrictions, for example, on the use of Zoom. So, for example, the US has a list of sanctioned countries, which leads users from 22 states not having access to Zoom, including Sudan, for example, but also Belarus and many other countries in the whole world. And this is, of course, especially for think tanks that work internationally or that have partners or target groups in those countries that they want to work with. This is a very interesting move, also in the name of actually security. So how do you assess this? And maybe there have been similar attempts by other countries as well. And what do you think should think tanks make of this?
Wow, difficult to answer this question. I think no one really has a complete overview about all these restrictions that different companies face. So if this is a worry that you're facing, if you mentioned Uganda, I think, if you work in this region, then you probably should use an open source tool, because if you use an open source tool, there is not necessarily a company behind it that can be charged with, export restrictions and stuff like that. But even with Jitsi and so forth, there tends to be a company behind that. But there are some, how to describe this? There's some workable solutions that you can basically self-host, and then you're not relying on a company for that stuff. So this could be a workaround, but I think it's a really overlooked problem because, as I mentioned, no one really has the broad scope what is legally allowed where on the world. And this basically relates to one of my points on the slides, that you have to consider your target audience as well. So if you're working on that region and if you need to speak to people in the regions, you probably need the tools that they can use. We have this discussion with China, for example. If a lot of Chinese researchers in Germany, they need to use WeChat because they need to be in touch with Chinese researchers and scholars over there. And WeChat is the tool of choice because WhatsApp is not working in China. But WeChat gives us a lot of headaches because, the Chinese state is probably sitting on top of it. So this is a really difficult trade-off. If you have a situation like that, then maybe separate devices might be helpful. So segregate your work device that you use for internal communications from your WeChat device that you use for communications in China or in other regions of the world. It's not just China, it's other countries in the world that have different messengers and stuff like that and different preferences. And having a secondary phone for that could act basically as a burner phone or a burner device, that might help.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting point that you're raising, because we've also had this observation that because many public institutions weren't very well prepared for going online, and they just prohibited, for example, the use of Zoom. And also someone in the chat now, Etienne, was mentioning that Zoom, for example, might also be blocked from companies' intranets. But then, the result that we saw was that many public officials still have to do their work somehow, right? So they retreat to their personal devices, which actually creates this dilemma that you just mentioned, which are actually less safe than their work devices in the end. Yeah, also I think it's a question where you have if you have a VPN client, if it's open and so on, if this is creating additional insecurities. Yeah, this is also an interesting point. I want to take up some more questions from the chat. So we've had some more questions about other devices, such as, or not devices, apps like Big Blue Button, Blue Jeans, Jitsi. Those are the ones that are, I think, and also the survey from our first event in the series shows this. They are least used in the think tank sector. So is there anything like maybe a good comparison online that you can recommend that we can look into, or any trusted source for information like this? So there are foundations, there are organizations which work specifically on these questions of consumer protection in the internet, and maybe data protection. So maybe there's some further sources also on these questions that you might want to recommend.
Yeah, now you caught me. I know that there are many of lists out there, because I think in the 3rd or 4th week of March, there on Twitter, there was an explosion of comparison lists about online video conferencing tools, and from data protection officials as well. So if you Google this stuff, you probably find something like this. But unfortunately, I don't have any link as of right now that I can clearly point you to. But this is not so hard to difficult. Mm-hmm. The more general question, what to use, I'm really hesitant to answer this, because as I try to make the point, it really depends on who you are, what your requirements are, what type of organization you have. Yeah, there's a link right now. Excellent. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
So you need to answer these questions for you, and then you have to try out different things, because the real issue that I was talking about as well is this usability and security trade-off that you have in many cases. Because if you use a secure system that is not really usable because, I don't know, it crashes your browser, or the audio quality is so bad that you can't do any meaningful progress in your internal communications, then you have won nothing, so to speak. You have a secure system, but you cannot work with it. So yeah, you need to define what's important for you, what your infrastructure is, what you require from a tool, and then you have to experiment with this stuff. I know it's not really satisfying. And if you think about all this onboarding stuff that you have to convince your employees to use this stuff and to experiment with this stuff, it's might be frustrating for the not so tech savvy people.
And it's also a financial question for small think tanks, right? Because most of our organizations don't have big IT budgets. And if you invest, for example, in a pro account on Zoom and like the webinar add-on and this add-on and that add-on, then you're in the thousands of euros. So maybe one advice for ThinkTanks in Germany, I don't know about other countries, if you maybe have similar services. So there's a website, it's called Stifter Helfen, and they provide discounted access to software that is widely used in the NGO world. And you can go there. It's basically an in-kind donation that they make to your operations. And I think this is a very good thing. And they also give out Zoom licenses for, I think, 50% of the actual price. We actually saw that too late. But yeah, this is an option that you might want to try also for other services. I think moving on from Zoom and video conferencing tools, there was a very interesting question by Sonia asking, besides attacks to confidentiality of closed events, does anyone have experience with black PR and trolls who manipulate your public statements and publications, and how did you counter it? Matthias, do you have any experience with that, or have you heard of think tanks that we might contact for experiences? And if anybody else of you have had some experience with that, please write in the chat. And just take care that you send your message to all and not just Matthias and me.
Yeah, this is a really an interesting question, but unfortunately, I don't really know about an instance. I mean, we know that intelligence agencies sometimes rebuild websites, not just of think tanks, but maybe of political parties, for example, to use this as what's called a watering hole. A watering hole is an attack technique that basically lures a potential victim to a manipulated website and then install a malware, for example, by attaching it in a download link. So it looks like the real deal, but it's not. And if you click on something, then you get infected. So this is not black PR, this is not trolling, but this is an attack vector that's out there in the wild, and it happened before, but I cannot point you to any specific organization or think tank for that matter. Probably if you look at Ukraine, you might find examples of black PR, but I don't really have experience with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, generally, I can just add that we can learn a lot from countries like Ukraine, which have had to deal with fake news as well, and deep fake and so on, long before it was actually a topic in the West. And this is they just have much more experience and knowledge about how to deal with these things. Yeah, so we are coming to an end of our event today. Thank you very much. Maybe just in order to close this up, how do you think, Matthias, this subject will develop? Do you think that the companies that we've just talked about will up their security standards in order not to lose the market, especially in Europe, where we have GDPR, general data protection laws that are much stricter than in many other regions of the world? Do you think there is a new tool on the market that we should monitor, already, because it might get very promising, that we haven't really paid much attention to? So how do you think will the subject develop in generally?
Right. Yeah, so it's really hard to predict, but from my experience, I would say this is a cat and mouse chase. I'm not really sure if this is the correct metaphor in English, but what I mean by that is that, okay, companies are fixing their products and security tends to get better, but also the bad guys are upping their game. They're getting better as well. So, a product is safe for a while, and then new attack techniques come up, and then they proliferate, and now everyone can do it. So yeah, it's, an up and down. It gets better for a while and it gets worse again. And this is the constant progress of IT security since at least the, 70s or 80s or something like that. Generally speaking, I talked a lot about the probability of hacking Zoom and stuff like that. If you think about this more from a more broader perspective, I wouldn't worry about this too much, because the dominant attack vector still is email. So if you have basic IT security hygiene in your shop, in your organization, like if you have user awareness training not to click on every link in an email or not to open every attachment uncritically, then you can protect yourself against most of the stuff if you have sensitive training of your people. Even better if you have two-factor authentication going on. Two-factor authentication basically means that you have to enter a second, normally randomly generated code additionally to your password. And this basically prevents most of the phishing attempts that are out there as of right now. And most of the attacks go via email or come via email or via phishing. So if you protect against this stuff, you are probably in the 90% safe area. The other 10% you probably cannot defend against, but okay, this is something that we have to live with. So focus on your basics and you should be pretty okay for most of the time. Good last word, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I learned a lot today. I think it was very surprising for me actually to hear that insiders in the organization are actually the biggest cybersecurity threat, because I think we've all focused a lot on, like, you know, Zoom bombing, uninvited guests from the outside joining us. So this is really something that's important. Also, what you just mentioned, this awareness that we need to create among ourselves, and which are some very basic housekeeping rules in a digital world, and which are, you know, not actually so specific to the Corona lockdown. And also to just see how can we actually strike a livable balance between usability on the one hand and the functions that we need to do our work, and on the other hand to and then not to be, you know, afraid and then just go home and just send all messages with birds again. So on this is on the one hand, and on the other side having of course a sensible safety in order to still be the ones that can provide spaces to test policy ideas in a more or less confidential space. And I think we should still try. I think we should take seriously what you just said, you know, go into that cat and mouse chase and try to make the best of it and stay on top of the news, what develops, and see what we can do. And I think this was very interesting to learn more about how we can actually go about this. And also I want to thank Matthias, of course, for sharing your knowledge with us. It was very interesting to have, you know, both perspectives, and also hear a little bit about how your own organization is dealing with this. Thank you all, everyone else, for joining us today, for your questions. It was very interesting. I hope you liked today's event. Please give us feedback, take the survey, which I will publish right now, and of course, drop your suggestions in the chat. So there should be a feedback survey now visible to you. There is, please drop your suggestions for upcoming topics and speakers in the chat. That's what I wanted to say. And of course, share with us any ideas how we could make this web series even more relevant for you and the work you do. I said in the beginning that our topics are basically crowdsourced. They're based on suggestions that come from the community of think tanks. So just let us know. We are building this series as we go. And documentation. We have received many requests for the recordings of our past events. Please check them out here. I'm posting the link in the chat, so you can actually go there and see what we covered before. And we have all the recordings up there. And we will, of course, also upload this one as soon as possible. And if you found this useful, please keep coming and tell your colleagues about it. The next event in the series will be in 2 weeks from now, on Thursday, 28th of May, on the topic Flatten the Curve, etc., the role of numbers and data visualization in times of COVID-19. Please watch our website of DGAP to receive notice when registration for this event opens. And as I said in the beginning, of course, you're welcome to continue the conversation beyond tweet your thoughts, and maybe also any more tips and good practices and comparisons that you might stumble upon online. Just share them on Twitter with us and all our fellow think tankers using the hashtags digital think tanking and WonkComms. So thanks a lot, and goodbye, everyone.